Hello everyone, welcome back to another lesson with Rivera Fine Art Studios. Today I want to talk about drawing eyes. So I'm going to do a series of drawings of eyes from different people and talk about how they differ based on ethnicity, age, etc. So the first thing I want to do, even before I start drawing the eye itself, is I just want to talk about the structure of what an eye is. An eye is essentially a sphere. You want to always remember that it is a round sphere. So if we take away the skin, we are basically looking at a shape that is more or less a perfect circle. In fact, it's one of the only perfect circles that you'll find in the human body when we're looking at human anatomy. And when drawing a sphere, if you've had any type of a basic drawing class, the sphere, depending on how it's lit, you will have a light side and a shadow side. So if I use my charcoal pencil, I'm using a gray paper by the way, I'm going to have an area that's where the light is hitting it, and then that's going to transition towards the shadow, and then the shadow side would fall somewhere over here. Now that same basic concept can be applied to shading an eye. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a little bit. But basically, this is what we have. We have a light side and a shadow side, and the eye itself is reflective. So the other thing we get is a very strong highlight, an area where the light is very, very bright. And that's something that you will often see as a strong highlight when you're looking at a person's eye. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is just draw a couple more of these spheres and look at how the eyelids are going to conform to these shapes. So I'm just going to draw about 3. So maybe I'll throw one over here. I'm smearing away my original drawing a little bit. It's okay though. Okay, so I'm just going to create a whole page of these. Always add those lines back in. But basically now what I think about, if I'm drawing the eye and I'm looking at it from a straight-on view, I'm going to have a center point. Okay, so if I'm looking at it from a straight-on view like that, let's say the center of my eye is right there. That's where my iris and my pupil would sit. If I was to shift that in any direction, so let's say I shift it to the side, you can almost think of this as a longitude and latitude line. That center line is also going to shift. And now that it is turning, you're going to see some of the curvature as you move up and down and from side to side. And maybe I'd have another one that would do something like this. And if it's turned up, that line is going to arc like that. Okay, so now for each of these views, the eyelids are going to wrap around the eyes in a very specific way. So if we're looking at a straight-on view, if I look at where the high point and the low point of those curves are, they're going to be right through that vertical center line. And I might have a little tear duct on this side, that little triangular piece, that pink little triangle that you get right in the corner. And the other side will come up, so I have a shape that looks something like that. And then the eyelids will sit on top of this. From the 3/4 view, the shape of the eyelids are going to change. So now I have a much more gradual slope on one side than the other. So as this curve comes around this way, it's going to start to expose the edge of the eyeball. So the edge of the eyeball, once again, sits over here. And comes down like that. And again, I have the tear duct in the corner, right there. And my lower ridge, high point and low point. So the lower ridge, the low point of that, once again, falls on that vertical center line. And then it starts to arc back up that way. Okay, so now I can start getting a little bit more specific. So let me just zoom in and talk about the planes a little bit. So there's a bunch of subtle planes that you could start to depict when you're drawing the eye. Now, if we think about the eyelid, basically what that is that's a little hood that hangs over the eyeball, protects the eyeball. So if we think about that little hood, there's basically a plane that comes back this way. So again, if we kind of look at imagine a linear structure over this, we have this plane coming out. That's the plane of the eyelid. And then this side plane tucks back in that way. And then once it comes to the eyeball, it starts curving out again. So a lot of that stuff can be indicated with shading. So basically then we have this plane, then it comes out again because there's a thin plane right here, very thin plane along the lower eyelid, and then it starts to come back this way. Okay, so now let's say I want to start shading this. I want to add a light source. I want to have a light side and a shadow side. The only other thing I want to do before I get too far into this is just draw out where the upper eyelid, the crease of the upper eyelid will fall. Okay, and even at this stage, I'm now ready to start adding some values. So what I'm going to do is just lightly go over this with my chamois. Just knock down some of those lines a little bit, clean up the edges, and then I will start to depict some shading. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of make up my light source here, but the very first thing I want to do is think about where my light is coming from. Okay, so I'm going to say that I'm going to kind of light this the opposite way. I'm going to have more light falling in the corner on the left side here. Switch to my light pencil. This is my white charcoal pencil once again. And I'm just going to kind of throw in where some of that light would be. And then as I move across, again, this is a rounded form. So now again, I'm thinking about that transition from light to dark. So my shadow will start to happen right about here. Okay, and again, that's going to accentuate the roundness of the eye. You want to always keep in mind that the eye is a sphere. Something else that I can add at this stage is the iris. Now, this is something that I haven't talked much about, but when drawing circles, if we take a circle and we turn it sideways, it becomes narrower. We have an ellipse or an elliptical shape. So what's happening with the iris, as it turns to the side, it's becoming much more elongated. And that really has to do with perspective. Okay, so I'm just going to put a general value tone over the iris. Let's say this person has relatively dark eyes. Something like that. And now I'm going to start thinking about what happens inside of the eye, in the eyeball itself. Now, the interesting thing about the eyeball is we think of that as being very light, but what happens is that it's set slightly into shadow in most cases. When we're looking at somebody's eye, it's in shadow. So a lot of times the lighter value will happen on the skin around it. So, you know, the upper eyelid here, where I've added that light, for example, and let me also add some light down here along the lower eyelid. So in fact, then what happens is the eyeball is more of a gray tone. Not in all cases, but in many cases. So I'm going to just kind of add my highlight right here. And I will put a little bit of light around the iris, but I'm thinking once again about the fact that it's a sphere. Everything is turning this way, away from the light. So even as I start to add my lighter value in here, as I come towards the right corner, I'm going to just transition that into the gray of the paper. And you see how just that little transition makes the eye appear to be much rounder. Maybe I can filter a little bit of light into this side. But again, I don't want to get too carried away. The highlights are going to be the brightest because the eye is reflective. So the highlights are picking up the light. They're going to always be lighter than any other areas. Okay, so I've just blended out some of these values. Now what I'm going to do is start adding some darker darks. So I'm going to switch over to my compressed charcoal, and I'm going to throw in where the pupil would be. Now the pupil is a really dark. So when I'm drawing the eye, I typically think of that as one of my darkest values. Once again, that is somewhat of an elliptical shape. It's going to be similar to the iris. It's pretty much repeating the same shape as the iris, just on a smaller scale. So that sits in there, and then I might get some reflective light in other parts of the eye. So maybe towards the bottom here, where more light is going to be filtering in, might get a little bit lighter. Might get some reflected light over on this side. Okay, so you can start adding some of those tonal variations, and that's going to make the eye look more reflective. And the other thing, if you're looking at somebody with light-colored eyes, you might see little variations, little streaks that kind of move through here, like so. Okay, and if I'm going to get really hyper-realistic, I can even add a little reflection of the eyelashes in the eye, or in the highlight. Just these little bits of reflection can just give it that extra bit of hyper-realism. And then I just continue to look at my values and make sure that everything is making sense.